All right, I'm back working on this engine. I'm working towards turning it into a long block. Before I can do that, I got a little bit more work I got to do on these cylinder heads in preparation for the comp cams that I'm going to be installing. These cylinder heads have already been gone through, disassembled, cleaned up, inspected, valves have been lapped in there. But these are the stock springs. I have a set of comp springs that I'm going to put in here. I'll leave the part numbers down below in the description. You can run some of the milder cams without upgrading the springs on these 4-valve heads, but I'm going to go ahead and put springs in there just to make sure that if we ever go to a more aggressive camshaft, we have the ability to control it with the springs that are inside here. The cylinder heads for this engine are DB castings. The DB and DC castings are generally accepted as the better casting as far as the C heads are concerned. They have better flowing, better coolant flow. They have the 9 threads for the spark plugs. It's a later casting. If you're looking for the casting for one of these and you want to get the DB or DC, on the exhaust side of the heads, you're going to have a long number, and the last digits are going to be what's going to tell you if it's a DB or a DC head. So these are DB heads. To remove and install these valve springs, and the comp cam valve springs, I'm going to use this tool by Euro Export. This tool, I've used it before in previous videos. I love it. They're still available on their website. It makes this job so much easier. First thing you need to do is remove this cam cap. When you're lifting up on these cam caps, you want to be careful. There are little guide pins that hold them on there. You can pry up on them and tap a little bit. Just take your time getting them up. And this tool is clearly marked exhaust side, so it's going to go down over the top where the cam caps were. I'm going to lightly install that. These don't need to be torqued down, just need to be basically held in place. Now to push the valve spring down, you can put this piece down in there and this screw goes through it. Now before I compress the spring, I'm going to put a rag underneath the valve to keep the valve from going down. This will hold it up as the spring gets pushed down. And now I'm going to run this down and get the spring compressed. Once it's compressed, you can see that the keepers are just kind of hanging out in there. So I'll use a magnet to grab those keepers out. And with the little keepers out, I can release the pressure of the spring. And now I can easily remove the spring and the retainer. For springs and retainers, I'm using comp cams, Beehive springs, and steel retainers. It should be self-explanatory, but on these Beehive valve springs, the smaller end is what goes towards the top. And with the valve springs installed, I can go ahead and compress that spring down. Now the fun part is installing these little keepers right here. These things can go up missing pretty easily, so what I do is I just kind of slide one in, and then once I get it in there, I'll rotate it around to the back side using a little screwdriver or a pick or something like that. Rotate it around. And then you can put the other one in and kind of do the same thing. And, use the pick, get it in place, get it in the grooves. And once you have the keepers in the groove, you let up on the tension here and it'll kind of suck them in place. One little tip you can use, which I didn't do on this one, is if you're struggling with it, you can put a little bit of assembly grease on the keepers, on the inside of the keepers, and then when you put them in there, they'll actually stay in place around the valve. And then when you loosen it up, they'll kind of slide into place, or they'll stay there. And once you have it, all the tension off, you can double check to make sure that there's no gap between the two keepers and that the valve retainer is the same height as the other valve spring. And once you got that one in there and it's good to go, then you can move on to the other one. And there's only 31 more to go. All right, I got all the valve springs installed on this cylinder head. Took relatively no time at all. Being sarcastic. But that tool really does help out a lot. The Euro export tool helps out a lot. Okay, if you're following along and building your own engine, when you're taking these cam caps off, make sure you keep them in order, that you don't mix them up, because they need to go back the same way they came off. But don't worry about tightening them back on all the way right now, because we're going to have to clearance these for the camshafts. Now, once you got it all back together, whatever it is that you're doing, you're replacing the seals, this already has new seals in it. Just replace the valve springs in there. Whatever you're doing, once you get it back together, I like to go down the line and just kind of tap them just to make sure they're seated. I like to use a brass punch when I go through and do this. And also make sure when you're tapping them down that you're not hitting them so hard that whatever surface is underneath there, you're gonna run into it. Even though this is wood and it's soft, I'd prefer not to jam these valves down into it. The last thing I like to do before I consider the valves and the springs installed and everything good to go is I like to do a vacuum test on it. I got this Goodson adapter. It's got a little spongy thing on there to keep a seal on here. All I do is stick that on there, and I'm going to try and suck up 15 inches of vacuum. And it should stay there, or sometimes it slowly will release down. That means you know you have a good seal on there, and these valves are sealing really good. So I'll go down the line and test all these, and I'll check the exhaust side. Okay, so that does it for this episode. This head now has good valve springs in there. I checked the vacuum on all the ports, it's good. Next up, I'm going to put the cams in there, get the comp cams in there. Probably going to have to clearance these cam caps. Once I get that all done, I can install these heads.